If you're a parent, teacher, or school leader, and you're sick and tired of the frustration, anger, and unfair treatment of children at high risk in our public schools, then perhaps it's time for all of us to do something about it. In this podcast, Dr. Amitra Berry brings you tips, tools, strategies, and tactics to build successful solutions while touching, moving, and inspiring all of us to transform our schools so that every child thrives. Here's your host, Dr. Berry.
Welcome back, Equity Warriors. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of the 3E Podcast. I am continuing on with our assignment to evaluate the impact of Project 2025 on public education and marginalized learners today. So let's get back to that. For those of you just tuning in to the biggest educational equity issue of 2024's presidential election, and frankly, everything else down ticket, let me give you just a little bit of a background on Project 2025. Those of you who've been listening, quick review. So Project 2025 is coming out of the Heritage Foundation and several other very right-wing, extreme conservative groups. They say conservative, I say extreme. It is a policy blueprint. And if you watched anything like the DNC convention, you'll notice they came out with this giant 900-page book. Yes, the book itself, the whole policy is over 900 pages, but I'm focusing just on the 44 pages that deal with reshaping education in America. Big plan is that they want to eliminate the Department of Education, and that plays a crucial role in our children's education. So I recently did a short on social media. It only went out on social media, not on podcasts, and you watch that if you want to. Trump floated the idea of appointing the founder of Moms for Liberty, the crazy group that's banning books and doing some other things in schools. Her name is Tiffany Justice. I don't know if she made up that last name or what, but she is a far right MAGA zealot, and he wants to make her Secretary of Education. So if you didn't see that, check out Patreon, TikTok, or Threads for that quick, I think it's like a 5-minute short. Anyhow, previously discussed on the podcast in episode 107, we did a broad overview. I did a broad overview of what's in Project 2025. And I originally wanted to do 12 different episodes, one topic per episode, but there just wasn't enough time. There's so much going on right now. So 108, I gave you the eliminating the Department of Education and how they plan to reduce or eliminate federal data collection. Really important for you school leaders that are out there. In episode 111, I discussed the changes to curriculum. Hello, curriculum people. You need to listen to that one. And the increased emphasis on what they are calling fundamental subjects. Listen to episode 111. In episode 112, I went into vouchers and how they plan to privatize huge elements of public education. In 114, I talked about civil rights and how they will reduce and eliminate civil rights enforcement. Getting rid of the Department of Education does a lot to civil rights for our students and the way they plan to change student discipline, and then not in a good way. You want to talk about the school to prison pipeline? Check out episode 114. In episode 116, we had a guest host, Christina Pipkin, and she covered parental rights and LGBTQ student protection. So I encourage you to listen to that and encourage Pip because we want to keep hearing from her. Now today, early voting has already started in most states. Today, we're getting the last of these deep dives. Last two issues. Issue number 11 is the proposal to phase out Title I funding and to restructure special education funding. And then issue number 12, actually, issue number 11 is the Title I funding. Issue number 12 is special education funding. Sorry, let me fix that. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the disproportional impact to marginalized students, including our students of color, LGBTQ students, and students living, of course, we're talking Title I, students of low income. So let's start with Title I funding. What happens? Well, let's talk about what Title I does. So many of us have heard the term. Title I is really a cornerstone of federal education policy, and it provides resources, financial typically, but it can only be used certain ways. And it only goes to schools that serve high concentrations of low-income students. Now, different states handle the allocation of that funding different ways, but Title I is for students of low income, and a wide range of initiatives come out of that. All of them are designed to boost academic achievement for students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. That's where your Title I number comes from. In my work as a consultant, I've worked with schools who provide reading or math interventions, who hire interventionists to provide those services. It may be after school programs that provide intervention services. It's the instructional materials to provide instruction for intervention for students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. Now, why is this so important? Historically, there is a significant correlation, a connection between family income and academic achievement. And poverty, low income, is second only to being Black when it comes to an academic achievement gap. So you can just imagine if you're Black and Title I, okay, double whammy there. And so by targeting this money to students who are income disadvantaged, it plays a really vital role in our effort to close that persistent achievement gap. So what happens if they get their way? If Trump wins the White House, God forbid, what's the consequence of eliminating Title I? Or what they plan to do with it. So first and foremost, they're talking about phasing it out. That's what the plan says. They will phase it out over 10 years. If you believe that, if you trust that they will take 10 years, let me sell you some beachfront property in, I don't know, Idaho. I don't see a phase out. They're going to be pretty extreme. But what will happen is $18 billion in federal education funding will go away in the form that we now know it. So what happens? $18 billion. We're going to see if that type of cut would lead to broader, wider educational disparities. Schools are going to struggle to maintain programs and services. If you're a school leader or even a classroom teacher and you know that you receive Title I funding, think about where that money goes. We can see teacher layoffs because there are positions that are funded or supported through Title I funding. We can see increased class sizes because in some districts, Title I funds are used to reduce class sizes. And of course, you lose teachers, you got more kids in the same number of classrooms, or same number of kids, fewer teachers. So fewer classrooms, bigger numbers of children. And get my numbers straight there. We'd also see the elimination of a lot of those support programs that our students rely on in order to succeed. So close to home, take this down to your local level. Check out your school's Title I funding. If you're a parent and your child qualifies for free and reduced lunch, you need to start asking questions. How much Title I funding is going to your school, your classroom, your child? How is it being used? And think about what the impact would be. Ask questions to your school board. If that funding were to go away, what would happen to your child in your school? If you're a teacher, what would happen to your position, particularly if you're an interventionist whose position is funded by Title I? And of course, as I mentioned, that correlation between low income and race, particularly students who are Black and Latino secondly, but Black mostly. Title I, of course, is not going to be felt equally across all communities. There are some schools in some school districts where all schools are Title I schools. There are some whole Title I schools that might be the only Title I school in a district. But our low-income students, our students who qualify for free lunch, they are the primary beneficiaries of Title I programs. Those academic supports, the interventions, the early interventions or prevention programs, those go away. Students of color, social supports as well, because there are some places who fund the social, emotional support programs, counselors, with that Title I funding as well. Okay, so students of color who are more likely to attend a Title I school because the historic and ongoing socioeconomic disparities, basically it's de facto redlining, those would be hit particularly hard. And it's not just urban schools. They like to put urban as a label on to say of color and low income. But our rural schools, Our rural communities who have smaller school districts and may be more reliant on Title I funding, those are both going to be hit. Where you have limited local resources, a limited tax revenue, tax base, again, particularly in those rural areas, there's some severe challenges that are faced in maintaining educational equity. All right, that's Title I. Number 2 is special education. Last issue of Project 2025 is their plan to restructure special education funding. So currently, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, Special Ed, works to guarantee services for students who have identified disabilities. The other part of that is that IDEA provides crucial federal oversight, accountability, right? And if you live in a state where the state, like I do in Texas, who've ever gotten in trouble about what's going on with special education, you'll know it's a big deal. That federal oversight is crucial to our children. So the current the current model makes sure that it doesn't matter where a child lives. A child has a right to a free and appropriate public education that is tailored to their needs. That's the language you want to remember. We call it a FAPE, free and appropriate public education. So if you ever hear somebody talking about a FAPE, this is for parents especially, that's what they're saying. It needs to be a least restricted environment. It should be free. It should be public, appropriate. Okay. So this is what you're entitled to. A child with disabilities is entitled to. And the issue of oversight, we don't want to minimize that. That accountability, making sure that schools and districts meet standards, specific standards, in serving students with disabilities. So again, in episode 114, I talked about the reduction of civil rights enforcement if you are a parent of a child with special needs, if you are a leader or teacher in a school where you're serving students with disabilities. That would probably be almost every educator who listens to this podcast. If you are a school board member, you need to go back and listen to that. And I would really strongly encourage you to read all 44 pages. All 44, it's not that much, 44 pages of Project 2025. I think it's chapter 2. I keep wanting to say chapter 2, but the 44 pages on education, it's a chapter. Schools would also, schools and districts and parents would lose the mechanisms. Let me back that up. Parents would lose the mechanisms to challenge school districts that fail to provide services. So think about that. There's no accountability. You are losing rights losing civil rights to enforce what your child is entitled to. And as parents, you are losing the ability, even the mechanisms, the way to go about challenging a school district that is not serving your child's needs. Okay. They suggest instead, here's what they want to do. Project 2025 would convert IDEA funds, that special ed money, to block grants or educational savings accounts, or ESAs. So the school choice mechanism is what they call an ESA. They say it's a way for parents to get the money that is allocated for their child's services. And you can take that money and do whatever educationally you want to do with your child. So typically, in many states, that's a portion of the per pupil state funding that would have gone to public school systems. So they're saying that now the federal money, the IDEA money that pays for your child's services or supports your child's services would go to a parent in an ESA to follow the child. You could use the ESA for private school tuition, for homeschooling materials, online courses, tutoring, therapy, educational therapy, whatever those approved educational services are. Now, ESAs are a little more flexible in how they can be spent. Not like a voucher. The voucher goes to a private school, right? So a little bit different. In 14 states, they have implemented ESA programs, by the way, they're all red states. And the criteria for eligibility varies from state to state. Some restrict them only to students with specific needs. Others have a universal eligibility. Anybody can get an ESA, pull your kid out of public school and use that money for whatever you want. So Proponents of ESAs say that it empowers parents and it increases educational options. Critics, like me, I say it diverts funds from public schools. I'm in the camp of the critics, and I discussed this in episode 112, ESAs and vouchers. The change in funding, as proposed in Project 2025, would reduce the federal role in SPED. That's going to lead to as we can see already from 14 states that have ESAs and there's no consistency, a patchwork system. Quality and availability of services will vary not just from state to state, but maybe locality to locality. There are already tremendous discrepancies in services right now, even from district to district within a state. So altering how special education services are provided by essentially giving parents the money. And in many cases for students, it wouldn't be enough money to provide the services the child needs, because we get sort of like getting a discount when you buy in bulk when the children are in a public school system. Okay. And again, accountability. Accountability is key here. We look at sort of big picture negative outcomes, whether it's the SPED funding or the Title I funding. When we reduce federal oversight, we risk losing accountability and providing services to the children who are most at risk of provision gaps, of achievement gaps, of being overlooked. We can see growing disparities in the quality of special education. Some states might invest more heavily in those services. Other states might not. Right now, if you look at the way funds are allocated per pupil spending from state to state, there are huge differences. But weakening the legal protections on top of all of this, the legal protections that are currently afforded to students with disabilities and their families under IDEA, is tantamount to what I would call educational malpractice. It's wrong. It's just wrong. And like every other issue that I've covered in regards to Project 2025, the impact of these two proposals on our marginalized learners is the epitome of racism, genderism, and classism. Let me back that up. Racism, students of color. Students of color often face multiple layers of disadvantage in the education system. They are more likely to attend an underfunded school. Black students are more likely to be identified as having intellectual disabilities compared to other racial or ethnic groups. That's racism, folks. Black students are over 2 times more likely to receive special education services for emotional disturbance than students from other racial and ethnic groups. Again, that's racism, folks. Black students are more likely to be labeled as having behavioral disorders compared to their white peers. Again, that's racism, folks. And while there is some inconsistency as you look at data from state to state or district to district, there is still significant evidence of overrepresentation of students of color in the category of specific learning disabilities. Teachers, you know what I'm talking about. There's a category called other health impairment, and that includes attention deficit disorder, ADD or ADHD. That category as well shows overrepresentation of students of color, broadly students of color. So the combined effect of losing both Title I funds and the current IDEA structure will exacerbate existing educational inequities and further widen achievement and provision gaps. And in case you missed that, the fine detail in there, overrepresentation tends to be more pronounced in subjective disability categories that are open to interpretation, emotional disturbance, intellectual disability. And then there's also under-identification, which is still a disproportionality, of Black students with autism. So disproportionality is not just about identification. It extends to placement in more restrictive educational settings. If you are labeled as having a behavior disorder, you are placed in a more restrictive educational setting. And that means we have higher rates of disciplinary actions for students of color with disabilities because, again, this is very subjective and interpretive. Keep in mind what I covered in episode 114 about civil rights protections and the change in how discipline will be handled under Project 2025. All of that, folks, racism. I also said it's the epitome of genderism. So let's look at LGBTQ students real quick here. For LGBTQ students, the loss of federal protections and oversights are harmful. Again, episode 116, PIP covers the issue of student protections or loss of student protections. There is the potential, they have made it quite possible, for increased discrimination in school choice programs that might be implemented to replace some current structures. Again, if you have someone like Tiffany Justice from Moms for Liberty, who's in charge, who is the Secretary of Education, what they're doing right now is attacking these students very specifically. So there being no consequence for discriminating against students because of their gender identity, or their sexual preference. And then mental health services and support services for LGBTQ students, which are crucial, could be at risk of cuts or elimination. There's your genderism. And then classism. We've talked Title I. So students who live in students of low-income families, they stand to lose the most, particularly from these last two changes. The elimination of targeted assistance programs funded by Title I could remove some critical supports that help these students succeed. At the same time, reducing access to quality SPED services, special education services, can further limit opportunities for students with disabilities who come from low-income backgrounds. So that would widen what is already a significant opportunity gap. When you look at that intersectionality of race and poverty, race and low income, these students are doubly marginalized. We are looking at devastating, life-altering impacts on their academic achievement, on their mental health, on their life trajectories. This impacts all of us. All of us. There are broad societal implications here. Sure, when it comes to educational equity, we have a long way to go. Our schools are not perfect. Progress is not what it should have been, but at least we were moving in the right direction. Were that not so, there would be no need for this racist, genderist, classist proposal that is Project